He didn't just lie to me, he built an entire second life while sleeping beside me. That's how this story begins. Not with shouting, not with a dramatic revelation, but with a quiet truth that unraveled my marriage thread by thread. I used to believe trust collapsed in a single moment, a sharp betrayal you could pinpoint, but it doesn't. It dissolves slowly, hidden in late-night messages, unexplained laughter, and the glow of a phone turned slightly away. I was a wife trying to understand why my home no longer felt like home, why the man who once held my hand now held secrets instead. The suspicion didn't start loudly. It arrived in whispers, in inconsistencies, in stories that didn't quite match the look in his eyes. This is the journey of how I followed those whispers, not out of paranoia, but out of survival. How I uncovered the truth not through confrontation, but through clarity. And how one woman learned that sometimes the quietest betrayals demand the loudest courage. If you want to follow the full emotional journey, every twist, every heartbreak, every moment of truth, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter. I always thought quiet evenings were the safest part of a marriage. The sun thinning into gold outside the screen door, the smell of cut grass lingering from the neighbor's mower, the soft clatter of my keys on the kitchen counter, small rituals that made 32 feel steady. I pushed the door open with my shoulder, hearing its familiar creak, and stepped into the same house I'd built 1,000 dinners and 100 apologies in. The living room lamps glowed low, the kind of light that made shadows stretch but never threaten. I set my bag down, brushing off the scent of stale office air, ready for another routine night with Jake. Nothing dramatic, nothing unusual. Just us. Or the version of us I still believed in. I didn't know then that a story could split open quietly. That betrayal didn't always kick the door in. It sometimes waited on the sofa, screen lit, breathing steadily. Jake was slouched into his side of the couch, head bent over his phone, thumbs moving quickly. He smiled, a soft, private smile, but cupped the screen almost instinctively, tilting it away from me when I stepped closer. "What's so funny?" I asked, half teasing. "Just dumb stuff from work," he said without looking up. He always used to show me everything, memes, texts, even the boring spreadsheets he pretended were thrilling. Tonight, he didn't offer the screen. He just nudged it lower, like it was a delicate thing that couldn't face the kitchen light. His laugh sounded light, but the way his fingers shielded the phone felt heavy. A backward glance at me, then down again, as if I'd interrupt something fragile. Harmless, I told myself. People get protective. People change. But the smallest shifts often matter more than the loud ones. I felt that shift like a draft against the back of my neck. I stood there for a second, remembering when we used to trade phones across the table at diners, swapping playlists and photos and grocery lists, like kids trading stickers. Back then, trust was effortless. Passwords shared without asking, notifications ignored because neither of us had anything to hide. But something in his posture tonight felt sealed shut. His shoulders turned slightly away, not obviously, but enough that my instincts twitched awake. It wasn't the secrecy itself that rattled me. It was how practiced it looked. As if he'd already rehearsed the angle, the timing, the smile that smoothed over the gap. A marriage doesn't crumble in one argument. It stretches thin in the spaces where honesty used to live. And in that moment, the air between us tightened, quiet but unmistakable. My intuition whispered, "Not yet, but soon. Something is shifting." I walked past him toward the sink, letting the warm tap water run over my hands, the scent of old coffee drifting from a forgotten mug. Behind me, Jake's screen snapped dark the instant I turned around. Too fast, too defensive. "Need anything?" he asked quickly, voice a little higher than usual. "No," I said, keeping my tone even. But inside I logged it. A small entry only I would ever see. He closed the screen before I asked. A thin pencil mark across the day, not heavy enough to accuse but clear enough to remember. In marriage, patterns matter more than moments. And this moment pulsed with the kind of caution people use when they're guarding something fragile and forbidden. I rinsed my hands, listening to the water run, pretending not to notice him watching me over the rim of the darkened screen. He headed to the bathroom, leaving his phone on the kitchen counter, face up this time, oddly careless. I turned back to the sink, soap slicking the dishes under my hands, when it happened. The phone vibrated sharply. Once. Again. A third time. Short, urgent pulses, each one louder in my chest than the last. Then silence. A silence heavy enough to make me pause mid-rinse. The running water filled the kitchen, but those 3 vibrations cut through it like a coded message. Not a work email. Not the group chat he always muted. Something different. Something deliberate. I didn't move toward it. I didn't even look directly. But I felt the shift, the way a story begins not with a bang, but with a small mechanical tremor that refuses to be ignored. When I finally glanced over my shoulder, the phone was still again. Black screen, innocent, a little rectangular stone resting on wood. No glow, no trace of urgency, just a quiet object acting like it hadn't just opened a fault line between us. I turned the faucet off, wiped my hands on a towel, forcing myself to breathe. Maybe I am overthinking, I whispered under my breath, but the truth hovered just beneath the surface. Marriages don't unravel because of fear. They unravel because fear is dismissed long enough to grow teeth. I went back to the dishes, listening to the bathroom fan hum down the hall. I didn't touch the phone. I didn't need to. A beginning had already happened. Loud as those 3 silent vibrations that refused to leave my chest. Dinner was simple that night. Pasta, a bowl of greens, the soft scrape of forks that usually meant comfort. I set the plates down, poured water into glasses, and tried to breathe normally. Jake sat across from me, the glow of the TV reflecting in his eyes, though he wasn't really watching. His hand slipped under the table, phone cupped in his palm, thumb moving in quick, practiced motions. He laughed at something on screen, but the timing was off. It didn't match the TV at all. "Long day?" I asked, twirling pasta. "Same old," he replied, but his eyes stayed low. Attention split between me and whatever conversation lived behind the screen. I watched his shoulders rise and fall, just a little too tense. The pasta tasted fine, but something metallic lingered in the air. A quiet warning I couldn't name yet. I chewed slowly, studying the tiny shift in his smile, the way someone might examine a photograph for signs of forgery. He'd been working late a lot recently. Tonight was just another bead on that growing string. As he ate, he launched into a familiar explanation about deadlines, a difficult client, the need to get things right before morning. I'd heard the cadence before, smooth, even, rehearsed like a speech he'd practiced in the shower. I kept my face neutral, sipping water, letting him fill the space with words. The more he talked, the more each sentence felt pre-measured, safe, sanitized. I found myself listening the way I listened to training videos at work, absorbing tone more than content. My brain cataloged everything, the slight hesitation before certain details, the way he scratched behind his ear when he lied as a kid, the softness in his voice that meant he didn't want questions. "It'll calm down soon," he said. I nodded like I believed him, but belief had started feeling like a fragile thing, something that cracked if you looked too closely. I tried a soft test, the kind of question that seems harmless unless you know the map behind it. "What's your boss's name again? I keep forgetting." He blinked, one beat too long before answering. Not the name he'd used last week. Then, realizing the slip, he corrected himself quickly, almost casually, but not enough to hide the seam. I didn't react. I didn't raise an eyebrow or tilt my head. I just stabbed a piece of lettuce and kept chewing. The air shifted. He watched me for a moment, searching for signs that I'd caught the mistake. I gave him none.
There was a strange satisfaction in that, holding still while his mind ran circles around its own story. He looked away first, focusing on his plate as if the pasta could anchor him to something stable. I wiped my mouth with a napkin, letting silence do what questions couldn't. Unease settled between us like condensation on a cold glass. Quiet, slow but impossible to ignore once you reached out to touch it. I didn't have evidence, not yet. Only the outline of something missing.
A tone that didn't match the words. A story with pieces shaved off. He used to come home overflowing with small details. Funny coworkers, office gossip, dumb accidents at the copier. Now he offered only the skeleton of a workday. Vague stress, vague tasks, vague problems. The absence was louder than any confession. Marriage, I was learning, could fracture not from shouting, but from the space between two sentences growing just a little too wide. I caught him glancing at his phone again, the screen lighting up under the table like a secret lighthouse. He pretended not to notice. I pretended not to see. We both played our roles. I shifted the conversation to something lighter. A story about a difficult woman at my office who'd insisted her stapler was possessed. Jake laughed, but it was a hollow sound, landing 2 inches away from sincerity. His eyes drifted down again, drawn to whatever flickered on his screen. I watched the blue glow hit the underside of the table and felt a tiny ache pulse at the base of my throat. I didn't want to interrogate him. I didn't want to become the kind of wife who measured every breath her husband took. But tonight the air felt slanted, like a picture frame knocked slightly askew. I kept talking, letting humor cover the fact that I was observing him more closely than I had in months. I could sense him withdrawing even in laughter, somewhere else, with someone else, mentally stepping outside our home while his body stayed seated at the table. Later, he fell asleep before me, shoulders rising and falling in soft, steady rhythm. I lay beside him, staring at the ceiling, tracing the shadow of the fan blades circling slowly. From the living room, faint notifications chimed in irregular bursts, not loud enough to wake him, but loud enough to crease the silence. Each ping tightened something inside me. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I wasn't. Suspicion is a strange creature. It doesn't arrive fully formed. It whispers first, then waits to see if you'll listen. I folded my hands on my stomach, breathing in the dark, telling myself there were 2 possibilities. Either I was losing my mind, or something was beginning to crack. And cracks don't fix themselves. One afternoon, the house felt strangely peaceful. Sun coming in at a low angle, the quiet hum of the fridge, the faint scent of lemon from the cleaner I'd used earlier. Jake had stepped into the shower, steam already drifting beneath the bathroom door. For once, he'd left his phone on the dining table, face down, almost carelessly. I walked past it, then slowed, then stopped. The sound of water running told me exactly how many seconds I had before the vulnerability of that moment closed. My hands weren't shaking, but something inside me shifted, a calm resolve unfurling like a quiet tide. I picked up the phone, turning it over with the gentleness of someone lifting a sleeping child. The screen stayed black for a breath, then lit up. I didn't know what I expected. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. But I had crossed an invisible threshold, and some part of me already knew I wouldn't be able to go back. I didn't dive deep. I didn't scroll through messages or photos or apps that would scream invasion. I stayed on the edges, call history, recent texts, the places most people leave fingerprints without thinking. But his were wiped clean. Entire sections looked like fresh snow, untouched, impossible. Even the innocuous calls, work numbers, delivery confirmations were missing. It wasn't the absence itself that stung.
It was the intention behind the absence. People erase things for a reason. I felt my breath settle into a slow, steady pattern as I flipped through the tabs, each one a blank page pretending it had never lived another life. My fingertips hovered above the screen, not shaking, not trembling, just absorbing a truth I'd tried not to name. This wasn't carelessness. This was maintenance, routine, habit. Near the top of the screen, a small icon appeared, an app notification indicating the phone had recently cleared its history. The timing was too neat, too precise. I tapped it, but the moment didn't last. The water in the bathroom turned off, the pipes groaning softly as the rush slowed. Panic flickered through me, not fear of being caught, but fear that I'd lose the only chance to glimpse behind the curtain. I locked the phone immediately and placed it exactly where it had been, aligning it with a faint smear on the table as though returning a relic to its altar. My pulse kicked. I wiped my damp thumb on my jeans and stepped back, schooling my face into calm. The hallway lights felt too bright suddenly, as if they'd been waiting to interrogate me. Jake emerged moments later, hair wet, towel slung over his shoulder. He glanced at the phone as he picked it up, just a flick of the eyes, but sharp enough to catch. "You want something to drink?" he asked lightly, too lightly, his gaze dipping once more to the screen. It was subtle, but I saw it. The quick scan, like a man checking whether a lock had been tampered with. I answered him normally, though my heart hammered against my ribs with the rhythm of a sealed file. The room felt smaller, tighter. He dried his hair, acting casual, but tension radiated from him like heat off asphalt. I watched him without watching him, letting my breath even out. The smallest tells were unfolding, layering themselves over everything I'd been afraid to admit. Standing in the kitchen alone a few minutes later, I realized something painful and clear. Innocence doesn't usually require this level of upkeep. Most people don't regularly erase their own digital footprints unless they're walking somewhere they shouldn't be. The logic was cold, simple, undeniable. I leaned against the counter, pressing my palms into the wood, letting the truth seep slowly into me. This wasn't my imagination. This wasn't a bad week, or miscommunication, or a rough patch stretched too thin. This was someone managing a double life in small, curated pieces. I exhaled through my nose, steady and controlled, as if preparing for a conversation I wasn't ready to have yet. I made a quiet vow, not spoken aloud, not written down, but etched somewhere deeper. I wouldn't touch his phone again. I wouldn't chase shadows or feed paranoia. If I ever looked again, it would be through another path, one I chose, one he couldn't control or erase. I straightened my shoulders and filled my lungs with a slow breath, grounding myself. This wasn't about catching him, it was about protecting myself. I could feel the shift happening, subtle but solid, like the moment the tide stops retreating and begins to rise. I wiped down the counter not because it needed cleaning, but because the simple movement steadied me. Whatever came next, I knew one thing. This was the last time my hands would touch his secrets unarmed. Jake's voice carried from the kitchen, steady and practiced, as he spoke into his phone. I could hear every word from the hallway, each syllable placed just loudly enough for me to catch. "Yeah, I'll be here late, probably past 9, he said, the tone almost theatrical, as if the performance needed an audience. He paused, then added with a sigh, "Tell them I'll fix the numbers first thing." When he hung up, he stepped into the doorway, meeting my eyes like nothing was off. "Work's a mess tonight," he said. I nodded, wiping my hands on a towel. "Stay safe," I replied, keeping my voice warm, even. The whole scene felt oddly hollow, like watching someone recite lines from a play I'd already read the script for. He grabbed his keys, kissed my cheek, and walked out with the confidence of a man certain his story held. I didn't argue. I didn't ask follow-ups or poke at the edges of his alibi. I simply watched him leave, the door clicking shut behind him, and stood there, feeling the silence expand slowly across the room. The house settled into its usual evening rhythms. Heat clicking in the vents, the faint hum of the refrigerator, but everything felt staged, like a set designed to distract me from the truth. The kitchen light cast long shadows across the counters, stretching into places I didn't want to look. I poured myself a glass of water, the coolness grounding me. He'd said he would be late. He'd said it with certainty. And yet there was that tug in my chest, that small knot forming just beneath my ribs, telling me the story wasn't holding. I didn't know what I was waiting for, but I felt the night poised on the edge of something. I wasn't expecting a message from one of Jake's co-workers. It came in casually, just asking about a recipe I'd shared at a potluck months ago. We exchanged a few lines, light and harmless, until she mentioned something in passing. "Thank God Jake got to leave early today. Must be nice." I stared at the bubble of text, blinking once, twice, as if my brain needed extra time to absorb the words. Early. The exact opposite of what he'd told me. My thumb hovered over the keyboard, but I didn't respond. I didn't correct her. I didn't mention the phone call he'd performed in my kitchen. I simply let the truth settle, sharp and cold, into the hollow space beneath my ribs. Lies aren't loud when they break. They crack quietly, like ice underfoot. One precise fracture that tells you the whole surface is thin. The worst part wasn't that he lied about staying late. It was that he lied about something so small he didn't even need to. A pointless lie. One meant only to carve out time, to create a blank space in his timeline. I stood at the sink, rinsing a plate I'd already washed, feeling something inside me drain out with the water. This wasn't miscommunication. This wasn't stress. This was strategy, and the realization hollowed me out in one clean sweep. Outside, a dog barked somewhere down the block, the sound drifting through the open window. I watched the plate in my hands until the edges blurred. My marriage had always felt like solid ground, but right then, I felt the soil shifting, loosening beneath my feet. Not enough to fall, but enough to warn me a fall was coming. Nearly an hour later, I heard it. The familiar rumble of Jake's car easing into the cul-de-sac. The engine cut, then idled for a moment before shutting off. It was such a normal sound, so ordinary it almost felt cruel. I stood very still, towel in my hand, listening to the quiet click of the driver's door. The timing was perfect. Too perfect. The kind of coincidence that didn't need explanation, because the explanation was already obvious. His footsteps approached, steady, practiced, the stride of a man returning from exactly where he wanted to be. I didn't move. I didn't look out the window. I just waited, feeling the truth settle deeper, anchoring itself in a way that made denial impossible. When he walked inside, shaking off the cool air, I greeted him calmly. I didn't say the coworker had messaged me. I didn't ask why he needed those extra hours that didn't exist. Instead, later that night, after he'd fallen asleep, I opened a small notebook from the kitchen drawer, one meant for grocery lists, and wrote down the time he'd left, the time he'd returned, and the words he'd told me before walking out the door. A date. A simple entry, nothing more. Not revenge, not obsession. Just documentation. Truth preserved before it could be twisted. When I closed the notebook, the soft thud sounded strangely final. It felt like the beginning of a file being opened, one I never thought I'd need. But now I knew I would. I started small, a note here, a time there, nothing dramatic. Just the quiet discipline of someone trying to understand the shape of a shadow. In the evenings when Jake claimed a late meeting or a sudden task, I wrote it down. The hour he left, the excuse he gave, the tone he used. The little notebook fit easily in the drawer under the sink. nestled among sponges and spare batteries, a place no one would think to look. Each entry felt both trivial and heavy, like adding a grain of sand to a jar whose weight I couldn't yet calculate. I didn't reread the notes. I wasn't searching for patterns yet. I was simply collecting facts, the way a person touches the railing while walking down a dark staircase. Not because they're afraid, but because they know caution is sometimes the only light available. The details began stacking themselves without my help. Some nights, his shirt carried a perfume I didn't use, floral, faint, out of place. Other evenings, his hair was styled differently, a bit more gel, a bit more attention than a long workday deserved. His explanations came in smooth variations, traffic, meetings, difficult clients, but they were always delivered with the same hollow precision. I didn't confront him, didn't sniff his collar like someone in a melodramatic scene. I simply observed. The body doesn't lie as easily as the mouth does. Scent lingers, expression shifts, and I learned to stand still enough to notice the things he didn't realize he was revealing. If he felt my eyes on him, he didn't show it. Or maybe he was too distracted to care. I called my closest friend one night, sitting in my parked car outside a pharmacy, headlights off. The darkness made honesty easier. "I think something's wrong," I whispered. She listened without interrupting, breathing softly on the other end. "Either you trust him or you don't," she finally said. "But don't torture yourself in the in-between." Her words landed hard. I stared at the dim store signs across the lot, letting them blur in the streaks. "I just need to know I'm not imagining all this," I said. She sighed, a familiar sound of sympathy. "Then find out, but find out cleanly." When I hung up, I felt both steadier and more hollow. The truth was coming whether I was ready or not. All I could do was meet it with clarity. I started reading late at night, articles about infidelity, the psychology behind deception, the difference between paranoia and intuition. I didn't want to become obsessed, didn't want to lose myself in theories and warnings, but learning gave me a thin sense of control, like tightening the lid on a jar that had been rattling for weeks. I made a choice then. I wouldn't hire anyone to pry into his life. I wouldn't rifle through his pockets or search his car. I didn't want to be the kind of woman who chased ghosts. I needed facts, clean ones, undeniable ones. Facts that could stand on their own without me needing to justify why I'd looked in the first place. If the truth was out there, I wanted it to walk to me, not be dragged. Strangely, even while suspicion thickened, tenderness remained. I still loved him. Maybe not blindly, maybe not like before, but enough to want fairness. Enough to want the truth before I made any decisions that couldn't be undone. Every time I wrote another timestamp into the notebook, a quiet ache pulsed somewhere behind my ribs. Not anger, not yet. More like the soreness of a bruise forming under the skin before the color appears. But beneath that ache, something else was stirring. My self-respect, lifting its head for the first time in months. I wanted to face whatever was coming without doubting myself, without being told I was imagining things. I wasn't collecting evidence out of spite. I was protecting the parts of me he had stopped noticing. Late one night, with the house quiet and Jake asleep, I opened the notebook and pressed my palm lightly against its cover. It wasn't thick, not yet, but it had a presence, like a second heartbeat hiding in the drawer. I closed it without reading a single line. The pages weren't meant to punish. They were meant to steady me, to remind me that clarity was within reach if I kept documenting what was real instead of what I wished to believe. I slid the notebook back into the drawer, the wood creaking softly, and turned off the kitchen light. The house dipped into darkness, still and unbothered. But inside me something had shifted. I was no longer waiting to be reassured. I was preparing to know. During my lunch break at the office, I sat alone at a small table near the window, picking at a salad I didn't actually want. The sun warmed the glass, throwing a soft rectangle of light across my arms. Scrolling absently through articles, I stopped at a post where someone described losing their phone, but recovering everything through a cloud backup. Photos, messages, call logs, all resurrected with a simple login. I reread the line twice, the words settling with quiet weight. The phone can die, but the data survives. It wasn't meant to be profound, but something in me responded. I stared at my fork, feeling a slow alignment of thought, as if pieces already floating in my mind had been waiting for this single spark. Maybe I didn't need to touch Jake's phone again. Maybe I didn't need to break anything. Maybe all I needed was access to where the truth already lived. The thought formed carefully, deliberately, like a small flame taking shape in a still room. If the phone itself was locked, guarded, erased, what if I didn't need the device at all? What if I reached for what flowed through it? A place he never imagined I'd look. I felt my heartbeat shift, a subtle quickening that wasn't fear but recognition. I didn't want to become someone sneaking around with trembling hands. I wanted precision, not desperation. I closed the article and opened another tab, studying the way cloud accounts synced. Photos, messages, even deleted items if caught fast enough. Everything left a trace somewhere. Data wasn't emotional. It didn't lie, didn't flatter, didn't rewrite itself to soothe guilt. It simply archived. I sat there in the office cafeteria, surrounded by people chatting about lunch orders and weekend plans, while a new kind of clarity settled over me. That night at home, after Jake announced he needed air and went for a drive, I opened my laptop. I created a new cloud account, one he wouldn't recognize, with a password long enough to look accidental. The process felt almost clinical. Typing, confirming, choosing settings. But beneath my fingers, something trembled with purpose. I read forum posts detailing how to sync a second device quietly, how to enable automated backups, how to hide notifications. 1,000 small technical choices, none dramatic, none emotional, but each carrying the weight of survival. With every step, I felt both steadier and sadder. This wasn't the kind of preparation you make in a healthy marriage. This was the kind you make when truth has stopped coming willingly. I saved the login information somewhere only I would see, then shut the laptop with a gentle click. That night, Jake fell asleep quickly, the way people do when they feel unobserved. His breathing grew heavy and even, a familiar rhythm that once comforted me. I lay beside him, eyes open, listening to the faint hum of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. The room smelled faintly of detergent and his cologne, a scent I loved even though it had begun to feel borrowed. My hands rested still on my stomach, but my mind moved sharply, mapping the next step. I wasn't driven by revenge. I wasn't driven by obsession. I was driven by self-preservation, by the need to stop doubting my own instincts. Somewhere in the quiet, I felt a decision solidify. Calm, firm, unafraid. If I was going to uncover the truth, I would do it cleanly, and I would do it soon. In the dark, the glow from Jake's phone flared softly, illuminating the curve of his jaw for a second before fading. The screen didn't ring or buzz, it just lit up, an incoming notification he'd muted. The moment was so brief it almost felt imagined. But that faint light cut through the room like a whisper. I watched it flicker, then vanish, leaving behind a trail of thought I couldn't unsee. The device he guarded so carefully had just revealed something unintentionally. A pulse of secrecy. A hint that the story he told me wasn't the one he lived. I didn't move toward it. I didn't reach out. I simply watched, breath quiet, understanding that this wasn't a sign to confront him. It was a sign to continue what I'd begun. Truth, I realized, often announces itself silently. When the room fell still again, I made my choice. I wasn't going to tear his phone apart or demand answers he'd only twist into new shapes. I was going to unlock the truth in a way he'd never anticipate. Not by prying it from his hands, but by following the trail he didn't know he left. In the dim light, I turned gently onto my side, facing away from him, my heart beating with a slow, steady resolve. This wasn't the start of a war. It was the start of clarity. And clarity, once found, doesn't go back to sleep. I waited until Jake's breathing slipped into that deep, unguarded rhythm. The kind that told me he was far from waking. The room was washed in faint blue light leaking through the blinds. Enough to outline the edges of furniture, but not enough to betray movement. I shifted slowly, careful not to disturb the mattress, listening for any change in his breath. Nothing. His phone rested on the nightstand, close enough that I could reach it with one quiet lean. My pulse thudded low, steady, not frantic. There's a kind of calm that comes when you've already accepted the truth, even before you've seen it. I reached out, fingers brushing the cool surface of the device. It felt smaller than I expected, light, almost fragile. For a moment, I just held it there between my fingertips, feeling the weight of what I was about to do gather around me like a second shadow. I lifted the phone gently, angling the screen toward Jake's sleeping face. The light that blinked awake spilled across his closed eyelids. His features didn't twitch.
I leaned in, holding the device close enough for the facial recognition to register. It took less than a breath. The lock slid open soundlessly. A strange ache bloomed in my chest, not guilt, not triumph, but something quieter, sharper. I wasn't doing this out of malice. I wasn't hunting for heartbreak. I was reaching for clarity. I navigated through the settings with slow, deliberate swipes, mindful of every sound. The house was too quiet. Even the touch of my fingertip against the glass felt amplified. Still, I kept going, reminding myself this wasn't a betrayal, it was reaction, survival, a way to reclaim the ground I felt slipping beneath my feet. I downloaded the backup application, hands steady as though they'd rehearsed this moment long before my mind admitted it. I entered the cloud login I'd created earlier, a string of characters memorized in careful silence. Then came the toggles, photos, call logs, audio files, message histories. One by one, I enabled them, watching the tiny sliders shift from gray to blue. The device hummed under my fingers, syncing quietly. There was something strangely intimate about it, like listening in on a whisper meant for someone else, but spoken in a room you shared. I paused once, listening. Jake hadn't moved. His breathing remained deep, oblivious. I checked the notification settings, ensuring nothing new would appear on his phone. The mundanity of these steps contrasted painfully with the reality of what they meant. Every tap was a step deeper into a truth I could no longer ignore. Minutes felt like stretched out rope, taut with tension. I double-checked everything, not because I doubted myself, but because I knew I wouldn't get another moment like this, one where opportunity and resolve aligned so precisely. I didn't want to fumble, didn't want to scroll too far or open anything I didn't need to. This wasn't a search for scandal, it was a doorway. I navigated through the settings to ensure the sync would run without alerting him. The steps were small, technical, almost boring on the surface, but underneath them lived the knowledge that I was crossing a line he would never imagine I'd approach. When I finished, I backed out of every screen carefully, clearing my tracks the way someone might smooth sand behind them on a beach. I turned the display off, the screen dissolving into darkness once more. I placed the phone back exactly where it had been,
easing it into the loose grip of his sleeping hand. His fingers curled around it instinctively, as if even in sleep, he guarded whatever secrets lived inside. The sight pierced me unexpectedly, a soft pain landing somewhere below my ribs. Once, that hand held mine with the same ease. Once, I believed the phone was just a harmless object he used too much. Now it felt like the hinge of our entire marriage. I lay back down, pulling the blanket up to my chest, facing the opposite direction. I stared into the dark, letting my breathing match the slow rise and fall of the room. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt purposeful. The difference mattered. Sleep didn't come for a long time. Instead, I lay awake, feeling the weight of both the phone and the decision hanging between us. A quiet part of me mourned what this moment represented. The shift from trust to verification, from believing to confirming. But another part of me, steadier and more grounded, felt something else entirely. Relief. I had taken back a small measure of control. Whatever truth emerged from this, whatever shape it took, I would face it with clear eyes. I didn't need his confession. I didn't need theatrics. I needed data, facts, proof that couldn't be rewritten or dismissed with a soft apology. With that resolve threading through me, I finally closed my eyes. Not to sleep, just to rest long enough to meet whatever would arrive next. The next morning I moved through my routine with deliberate normalcy. Coffee, mascara, keys on the counter. Jake rushed out early, mumbling something about a project that should have been done yesterday. I kissed him goodbye without studying his eyes. At work, I tried to lose myself in emails and spreadsheets, but my mind hovered over a single anticipation, like a knot waiting to loosen. During lunch, I slipped outside with a sandwich, sitting on a concrete bench warmed by the sun. I took a slow breath before unlocking my phone. The moment it lit up, a notification slid across the screen. Backup complete. The words looked harmless, almost administrative, but my pulse tightened. This was the first truth arriving, not guessed, not imagined, not reshaped by anyone's voice, just data whispering, "I'm here." I tapped the notification, and a new folder opened, rows of files organizing themselves with quiet efficiency. Photos, messages, call logs. The edges of the world around me softened. The lunchtime chatter, the passing cars, the rustle of leaves, all of it blurred as my attention tunneled inward. The first images were ordinary. Jake's desk, a takeout box, a blurry picture of his shoe as if captured by accident. I almost exhaled in relief. Then I swiped again. A glass of water on a restaurant table, captured from his angle. In the reflection of the cup, faint but visible, sat the outline of a woman. My stomach tightened as if bracing for impact. I zoomed in, paused, then let the screen return to its full frame. The image wasn't explicit. It didn't need to be. It spoke with the exact quiet I'd been fearing. I opened the messages next. The thread was labeled with a number, not a name. Subtle enough to slip past a quick glance. The most recent texts appeared first. Small jokes, shorthand affection, a string of inside references I didn't recognize. I scrolled further. Tonight, he'd written on a night he'd claimed he was working late. Same place, she'd replied. Another line from him. Wish I were with you instead. My breath caught, but not in the dramatic way movies show. It was quieter, like a hinge locking into place. A truth that wasn't shocking but settling. I kept scrolling, each message puncturing something inside me with precision. She doesn't get me anymore, he'd written once. Feels like I'm living two lives. I stared at that sentence, letting it sink into the part of me that already knew. There were voice notes too, short recordings sent at odd hours. I pressed play on the first one, holding the phone close to my ear. His voice filled the small space around me, soft, warm, intimate in ways he hadn't been with me in months. "I wish you were here," he murmured, followed by a sigh that I recognized painfully well. It was the same sound he used to make when he curled around me after long days. I listened to 3, maybe 4 more, each one peeling back a layer of denial. The sound of his laughter, light, flirtatious, felt like a stranger wearing my husband's voice. I paused the playback, staring at the ground as a breeze passed through, lifting a strand of hair across my face. The world kept moving. Mine had shifted. I thought I would cry. I thought the tears would surge, hot and unstoppable. But nothing came. Instead, a cold clarity moved through me, settling in my chest like frost on a window pane. What hurt wasn't just the infidelity. It was how practiced it was, how familiar. This wasn't a crack in our marriage. It was a second life he'd built brick by brick while standing beside me. I kept scrolling. A new image appeared, Jake leaning toward a woman in the corner of a dimly lit restaurant. They were laughing, heads tilted close, unaware of anything but each other. The timestamp in the corner marked the exact hour I'd been washing dishes alone at home. I stared at it until the edges sharpened. I didn't save it, I didn't delete it. I just looked at it until I no longer felt surprise. When I finally stood up from the bench, my sandwich untouched beside me, I felt strangely steady.
The screen dimmed in my hand, waiting, as if asking whether I needed more. But I didn't, not in that moment. The truth had already rooted itself. It wasn't a storm. It wasn't an explosion. It was a settling, a quiet, inevitable alignment of all the signs I had tried so hard to ignore. I locked my phone and slipped it into my bag, standing tall as the wind lifted my hair. I wasn't broken. I wasn't even shaking. I was simply awake. And once awake, you can't return to sleep, not the kind that protects you from the truth. I spent the next evening in my car, parked beneath the soft glow of a grocery store sign. Rain tapped against the windshield in a slow, steady rhythm, as if urging me to keep going. My phone sat in my lap, its weight foreign and familiar all at once. I opened the backup again, not out of obsession, but because I needed to understand the scope of what I'd already glimpsed. The messages continued far beyond what I'd read at lunch. Entire conversations had unfolded while he lay next to me in bed, while I folded laundry, while I thought we were sharing a life. Lines of affection, apologies, plans, moments I thought belonged to us, now repurposed, recycled, handed to someone else like a second-hand gift. The deeper I read, the more surreal it felt. Not dramatic, not chaotic, just layered, built slowly, carefully, with the same patience he used to build a future with me. Scrolling through the message history felt like reading a journal I wasn't meant to see. Only it wasn't a journal, it was dialogue. Real-time betrayals dressed up as intimacy. At one point I paused over a thread where he reassured her about something. She won't notice, she never does. I stared at those words for a long time, letting them soak into me. I wasn't angry yet. Anger required heat, and all I felt was cold. They had shared jokes I didn't understand, references to places I'd never been. Their laughter spilled across the screen in emojis and half-sentences, a language I didn't speak. I wasn't jealous of her. I was grieving the version of Jake I'd believed in. The man who once kissed my forehead before leaving for work now lived an entire emotional life I had never been invited into. When I moved to the audio files again, the rain thickened, streaking the windshield in uneven lines. I listened to another recording, his voice low, coaxing, familiar in the worst way. "I just need you to know I'm trying," he murmured to her. "I feel stuck." The words hit hard. Those were the phrases he used to say to me when I lost my job years ago. Back then they'd felt like a lifeline. Now they felt like theft. I let the recording play twice, absorbing the tone more than the content. He wasn't speaking to a stranger. He was speaking to his chosen confidant, someone he trusted with his vulnerabilities while keeping me at arm's length.
Outside, the rain kept time with the ache settling quietly beneath my ribs. The deeper I went, the more I realized this wasn't a single lapse in judgment. It wasn't even a double life. It was a slow, deliberate rewriting of his emotional landscape, one where I had been replaced without being told I'd been removed. I unlocked a folder of images next. Selfies taken in places I didn't recognize. Shots of meals shared. Glimpses of a woman's hand or hair or reflection caught in the corner. Nothing obscene, nothing dramatic. Just ordinary moments that weren't mine. I swallowed hard, not from shock but from confirmation. A life is made of small moments, and he had given those to her while leaving me with the shadows. I closed my eyes briefly, trying to remember the last time he'd laughed like that with me. Nothing came. I didn't delete anything. That felt too final, too emotional. Instead, I created new folders within the cloud, naming them by date, grouping the images and messages in order. It felt clinical, like assembling evidence in a case no one else would ever see. The process steadied me. When heartbreak becomes fact, it stops flailing and becomes something you can hold. I made space for every file, refusing to minimize or dramatize any of it. These were the pieces of the truth I had sought, and though each one cut differently, the cuts were clean, organized, understandable. By the time I finished grouping them, the ache inside me had taken shape, sharp around the edges, but no longer amorphous. When I finally turned off the engine, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, tapping softly against the roof like a gentle reminder that the world was still turning. I looked at my reflection in the dark screen of my phone, tired, hollow, but grounded. This wasn't a question anymore. It wasn't a hypothesis or a fear. It was reality, undeniable, fully illuminated, precise. I leaned back against the headrest, letting the quiet settle. The question now wasn't whether he had betrayed me. That chapter had closed. The new question was what I intended to do with the truth I now held so carefully in my hands. And for the first time in weeks, the uncertainty felt less like a threat and more like a path. That night I stood in the bathroom with the door half closed, steam from my shower still fogging the mirror. My hair was damp, my skin warm, my reflection unfamiliar, as if I were looking at someone paused between two versions of herself. On the counter, my phone glowed faintly with the folder I had left open earlier. A collection of messages and images that had quietly rearranged the architecture of my life. I reached for a towel and pressed it lightly against my face, not to dry tears, but to steady myself. The soft hum of the bathroom fan filled the air, a small constant in a world that felt abruptly redefined. I didn't feel dramatic or shattered. I felt sober. Awake in a way that made the tiles beneath my feet seem colder, sharper. The truth had arrived, and with it came a strange, grounded calm. I turned toward the mirror, wiping a circle clear on the glass. The reflection that stared back at me wasn't broken. It was stripped down, honest. Behind me on the counter, the screen illuminated my profile, casting a thin stripe of light across the mirror. It reminded me of all the nights Jake's phone had glowed with messages I wasn't meant to see. Except here the light wasn't mocking. It was revealing. I looked at myself fully, shoulders squared, eyes tired but steady. I wasn't asking why anymore. I wasn't hunting for explanations or excuses. I was choosing clarity. The betrayal was real, but so was my ability to stand in front of the mirror and not look away. A quiet strength settled into my posture. I didn't need to justify my pain. I didn't need to dissect it. I only needed to face it. I gathered a few of the printed screenshots I had tucked away earlier. Messages, timestamps, a handful of photos. I placed them in a slim manila folder, smoothing the edges with my palm. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't ammunition for an explosion. It was documentation. Truth made tangible. Something I could hold if my resolve wavered. I slid each page inside thoughtfully, choosing what mattered, leaving out anything meant only to wound. This wasn't about shaming him. It was about grounding myself in facts so I wouldn't get lost in the noise of excuses. When the folder was closed, I tapped it once against my knee, feeling its weight. It wasn't heavy, but it carried enough to change the direction of what came next. For a moment, I considered the classic confrontation. The shouting, the accusations, the righteous fury. But none of that felt like me. Anger was easy. Noise was easy. What I wanted was dignity. Clean, sharp, unshakable. I stood in the faint bathroom light, imagining different versions of the conversation. Throwing the evidence across the table, slamming doors, demanding confessions. Each one felt theatrical, hollow. I wanted no part of that performance. Instead, I pictured something quieter. A conversation rooted in truth rather than theatrics. A space where I stated what I knew without flinching. A space where I didn't need to raise my voice to be heard. I inhaled deeply, letting that vision settle. It felt right. Not vengeful, not weak. Just resolute. I picked up my phone again, scrolling through the folder on the screen one last time. Not to torture myself, but to anchor my understanding. I read the words he'd written to her. The affection, the longing, the casual disregard for me tucked between sentences. Each message confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't a momentary lapse. It was a pattern, a choice. I locked the phone, pressing my thumb against the screen until it dimmed. The ache in my chest didn't expand, it compressed, becoming something dense and defined. Grief was beginning to shift into something else, something sturdier. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't flailing in uncertainty. I had the truth. And with the truth came the freedom to decide what would happen next. I turned off the bathroom light and walked into the bedroom, where the air felt cooler and quieter. The manila folder rested against my hip, a small, steady presence. I placed it gently inside my bag, not hidden, not flaunted, simply ready. The night stretched before me, soft and still, but no longer heavy with dread. For the first time in a long while, I felt the faint outline of boundaries forming, clear lines where fog had been. Whatever conversation was coming, it would be on my terms. I slipped beneath the blanket, closing my eyes not in defeat but in preparation. Tomorrow would not be easy, but it would be honest. And that, finally, felt like something I could stand on. The next evening I asked Jake if we could talk over dinner. No tone of accusation, no tremor in my voice, just a simple request. He agreed easily, almost carelessly, as though he believed whatever conversation I wanted couldn't touch him. We sat at the dining table with plates of reheated leftovers, the overhead light flickering slightly, casting brief shadows across the walls. I set my fork down, folded my hands, and looked at him fully. "Do you feel like we're drifting?" I asked. The question surprised him. His shoulders tensed, but his face arranged itself into a tired smile. "Babe, it's just work," he said, as if rehearsed. His voice was gentle, but something in it was hollow, an echo without a source. I listened, keeping my gaze steady, waiting to hear if any truth lived beneath the surface of his words. He leaned back, rubbing his temples in a gesture meant to look stressed but felt more like avoidance. "It's been a long month," he said. "Deadlines, pressure, you know how it gets." He offered the same handful of phrases he'd given me for weeks, soft, worn-out excuses that no longer held weight. He spoke as if performing a part he didn't even fully believe in. I nodded occasionally, not to agree but to show I heard him. "I'm trying," he added. eyes sliding away from mine. I still love you, you know that. The words should have meant something. Once they would have, but now they felt like wallpaper pasted over cracked drywall. Decorative, not structural. I kept my voice calm as I replied, I'm not asking for perfection. I'm asking for honesty. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Silence stretched between us, thin but loaded. He picked up his fork, then put it back down. What are you really asking? He said. The question sounded defensive, wary. I studied his face, every twitch, every flicker in his eyes. He wasn't opening up, he was fortifying. If there's something you're not sharing, I said, I'd like to know. I'd like you to trust me with the truth. My tone stayed quiet, almost soft, but the words carried weight. He laughed, a small breathy exhale meant to diffuse tension. There's nothing, Emma. You're overthinking again. That word, again, hit the table like a dropped coin. Familiar. Belittling. Practiced. I didn't flinch. I simply observed the speed of his denial, the reflexive nature of it. Truth doesn't rush like that. Panic does. He tried to counter with affection, reaching across the table, brushing his fingers against mine. But instead of comforting me, the gesture felt like a deflection, a shield he hoped would blind me to the gap widening between us. Let's not do this tonight, he murmured, voice low. I just want a peaceful evening. Peaceful for him, maybe. For me, peace had long been replaced with unease. I didn't pull my hand back, but I didn't lace my fingers with his either. I'm giving you an opening, I said softly. One without anger, one without consequences. Just truth. For a moment his expression hardened, the briefest flash of something cornered. Then it vanished, replaced with another tired smile. There's nothing to tell, he insisted. The lie wasn't loud, it was quiet, and its quietness made it sharper. A faint ache settled beneath my ribs, not from what he said, but from what he didn't. I had handed him an opportunity, clean and bare, and he'd turned away from it. Not even with hesitation, just ease. That ease told me everything. If he'd stumbled, if he'd paused, if he'd faltered even a little, maybe I would have believed there was something salvageable in the truth he was withholding. But his confidence in the lie, the smoothness of it, felt like the final stitch in a wound I'd been trying not to open. All right, I whispered, more to myself than to him. The decision forming inside me did not come from anger, it came from clarity. When someone refuses a chance to tell the truth, they choose the consequences that follow. After dinner, he turned on the TV and sank into the couch as though the conversation had never happened. I watched him from the doorway for a moment, taking in the familiar curve of his shoulders, the glow of the screen across his face. Once, this scene would have felt like home. Now, it felt like a place I was visiting for the last time. I walked to the bedroom, retrieved the manila folder, and placed it gently into my bag. Not to confront him yet, not to threaten, but to prepare. The softness I'd approached him with was the last he would receive without truth. As I zipped the bag closed, my breathing leveled. I wasn't entering a battle. I was stepping into my own boundary. The weekend arrived, wrapped in a deceptive calm. Sunlight spilling across the kitchen tiles, the faint buzz of the neighbor's lawnmower drifting in through the window. I was chopping vegetables at the counter when Jake wandered in with his phone in hand, tapping quickly, smiling at something on the screen he didn't bother sharing. The sound of his laugh, low, private, tightened something beneath my ribs. I moved to the sink, filling it with warm water and soap, the suds rising slowly as I stirred them with my fingers. Jake leaned against the counter, still typing, still smiling at a world I no longer belonged to. "Can I borrow your phone?" I asked lightly. "Just need to check the weather for the grill later." He hesitated only a fraction of a second before handing it over. The screen was already unlocked. My pulse steadied. I told myself, this is not revenge, this is preparation. I held the phone casually, turning toward the sink as if the movement meant nothing. My hands were damp from rinsing the vegetables, and soap clung to my skin in delicate bubbles. Jake stayed close, watching me with the kind of loose curiosity that comes from believing nothing is at risk. "Just don't drop it," he joked. The irony pressed against my throat. I smiled softly, tapping the weather app, pretending to scroll. The phone felt heavier than normal, like it carried the weight of every lie he'd typed on it. I took a step closer to the sink, my fingers still slick, my heart slowing into a careful rhythm. I didn't plan this moment to be theatrical. I only needed it to be believable, natural, a mistake he would never question. My breath steadied. The opportunity was here, delicate and quiet, waiting for a single move. The slip happened easily, far easier than I imagined. A slight shift of my wrist, a faint glide of soap across my palm, and the phone slid free of my grasp. In the half-second it fell, time stretched. I saw Jake's eyes widen, saw his body tense, saw the realization break across his face like a snapped wire. Then the phone hit the water with a dull thud, sinking beneath the suds in one clean motion. Bubbles burst. The screen flared briefly before going black. I gasped, a sharp, startled inhale, too natural to be rehearsed. "Oh my God," I whispered, reaching instinctively into the water as if trying to save it. "I'm so sorry. My hands were wet. I didn't mean..." The apology came out fractured, sincere in all the ways he needed it to be. And in that moment, it was real. I hadn't meant for the truth to ever live in that device again. Jake lunged forward, grabbing the dripping phone from my hands. "Jesus, Emma!" he shouted, not cruelly, but with the raw panic of someone watching something irreplaceable drown. He shook the device hard, water splattering onto the counter. "It can't be ruined! It can't!" His voice cracked, and he rushed to the drawer, fumbling for towels, muttering under his breath. I stepped back, drying my hands slowly on a dishcloth, watching him with a softness I didn't feel. He pressed buttons frantically, shook the phone again, tried powering it on. Nothing. The silence of the dead device filled the room. His panic wasn't about the cost. I saw that clearly. It was about the contents. Everything he'd hidden. Everything he'd erased. Everything he'd curated to stay in the shadows. And now, all of it was submerged beyond recovery. "I'm really sorry," I said again, quieter this time. My voice wasn't trembling. It carried the calm of someone who accepted an accident she couldn't undo. Jake didn't look at me. He was breathing hard. Towel wrapped around the ruined device, fingers gripping it like a lifeline. "I told you, God, why weren't you paying attention?" His anger was thin, brittle, more fear than fury. I let the words sit in the air without responding. I knew that in the cloud, the truth was safe. Every message, every photo, every whisper he thought he'd hidden was already cataloged beyond the reach of water. He didn't know that. He only knew this. The phone he trusted to hold his secrets had slipped from his hand and landed squarely in mine. When the chaos settled, and Jake disappeared into the bedroom to search for rice or hope, whichever he thought would resurrect what was gone, I stood alone in the kitchen. Water still rippled in the sink, small circles expanding outward from where the phone had hit. I touched the surface gently, letting the warmth brush my fingertips. This wasn't triumph. It wasn't satisfaction. It was a shift, a turning point. A quiet severing of the last tether he thought he could control. The truths he buried were already mine, not to weaponize, not to destroy him with, but to protect myself. I dried my hands, turned off the faucet, and exhaled slowly. The world did not crack open. It simply rearranged itself around what could never be undone. Jake spent the next hour trying to resurrect the phone as though he were trying to revive a fallen animal. He shook it, wiped it, pressed every button with rising desperation. The kitchen filled with the sharp scent of damp electronics and the low mutter of his frustration. I stood near the counter, drying the last of the dishes, feeling strangely removed from the scene, as if watching a movie I'd already seen the ending to. "It's dead," he finally breathed, staring at the lifeless screen. His shoulders sagged, his jaw clenched, and he looked both furious and frightened. I murmured another apology, stepping closer, but not touching him. "It slipped," I said softly. "I should have been more careful." The guilt in my voice was genuine, but not for the reason he assumed. He thought I mourned the accident. I mourned the moment our marriage had reached a point where truth required this kind of silence. After a few minutes, I suggested he borrow my phone or use his old one. He rejected both options immediately, pacing as though the kitchen tiles had suddenly become too small for him. "I'll just buy a new one," he snapped, dragging a hand through his hair. "I can't deal with this right now." The words weren't cruel, they were panicked. And panic, I realized, was its own confession. If the phone had only carried harmless chatter or work documents, he would have shrugged off the loss. But the distress in his eyes told a different story. I leaned against the counter, arms folded gently, and watched him search for solutions that didn't exist. "It's okay," I said quietly. "We'll figure it out." He didn't answer. He was too busy imagining what might now be gone forever. Later that night, he hovered over his laptop, frantically logging back into apps and accounts, trying to retrieve fragments of a life he thought he'd curated perfectly. The glow from the screen lit his face in uneven shades, fear in one moment, calculation in the next. I walked past him on my way to the bedroom, pretending not to notice the tension rolling off him like heat. "Need any help?" I offered, stopping at the doorway. He shook his head too quickly. "No, I've got it." His tone was clipped, defensive, as though my presence itself threatened the fragile boundary he was trying to rebuild. I nodded, stepping away, and felt something loosen inside me. This wasn't just a man upset about a broken phone. This was a man terrified of exposure. And his fear was louder than any confession he'd never give. In the bedroom, I checked the cloud on my own phone. Everything was still there, orderly, intact, untouched by water or panic. Photos, messages, recordings. Not because I needed them in that moment, but because I needed to know that nothing had slipped away. The soft glow of my screen flickered across the duvet, steadying me. I enabled an extra layer of security, not out of paranoia, but out of preservation. The truth no longer lived in the fragile shell of a device. It lived in a place he couldn't reach, couldn't erase, couldn't drown. As I set my phone aside, I felt a curious blend of guilt and relief washing through me. I hadn't planned to destroy his phone, but I had accepted the outcome. That acceptance, I realized, marked a new threshold, one I hadn't crossed before. Jake eventually came to bed long after midnight, smelling faintly of frustration and damp plastic. He didn't speak, didn't reach for me, didn't even sigh the way he normally did before falling asleep. He simply slid under the covers, his back turned, the silence between us thick with unspoken questions and unadmitted truths. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hitch in his breathing. He was grieving something I couldn't name aloud. Not the phone itself, but the secrets it held.
secrets he believed were gone. I closed my eyes, letting the calm settle deeper. What he didn't know was that those secrets were no longer trapped in a device. They lived with me now, quiet, undeniable, patient. When morning light finally seeped into the room, Jake was already gone, likely rushing to replace what had been lost. I sat at the edge of the bed, pressing my palms together, letting the quiet fill every part of me. There was no triumph in me, no satisfaction, just certainty. The physical phone was ruined, but the truth had taken root elsewhere. And in that realization, the balance between us shifted. The power he thought he held over the narrative had slipped, drowned silently in the same water that swallowed his device. I stood, smoothing the sheets, grounding myself in the routine. Whatever storm was coming next, I would meet it with sharp clarity, not fear. The truth was mine now, and I wasn't letting it go. Jake returned later that afternoon with a crisp white bag from the electronics store, the corners slightly bent as though he'd gripped it too tightly. He set it on the counter without looking at me. I watched from the sink as he unboxed the new phone, peeling away the protective film with quick, impatient fingers. "Might as well upgrade," he muttered, trying to sound nonchalant, but his voice carried a tremor he couldn't hide. I nodded, offering a small smile. "It looks nice," I said, as if we were discussing something ordinary, a kitchen gadget, a new shirt. He powered it on and the screen flashed brightly, reflecting in his eyes. For a moment, he seemed composed, but beneath that calm veneer was a man trying to rebuild a structure he knew had already cracked. I wiped my hands and stepped away, giving him space he didn't ask for but needed. Almost immediately he began setting up passwords, switching default settings, customizing lock screens. Every tap of his finger was careful, calculated. He added layers of protection he'd never bothered with before. New passcodes, fingerprint locks, even Face ID aligned meticulously. I watched quietly from across the room as he guarded the device with the urgency of someone who had lost control once and refused to let it happen again. He took the phone with him everywhere, into the garage, the bathroom, even to grab the mail. Whatever softness used to live in our home had been replaced by vigilance, but the irony was sharp. His new fortress didn't affect the truth I already held. The cloud contained more than this shiny device ever could. He didn't know that, and I didn't need to remind him. Days passed and the old patterns resurfaced as if nothing had changed. "I'm working late," he'd say, grabbing his jacket. "The client wants revisions," or, "There's traffic, I'll be delayed." His new phone buzzed and chimed throughout the evenings, with notifications he tried to hide behind casual gestures. I didn't push, I didn't dig. I simply observed. The weight of suspicion was gone for me. I wasn't guessing anymore. I knew, and knowing freed me from the frantic need to interpret every mood or glance. His efforts to conceal only made his choices clearer. This wasn't confusion or a rough patch. This was preference, routine. I listened to the sound of his car pulling away each night, feeling a strange calm settle in. Patterns, no matter how well hidden, always repeat themselves. While he continued his second life, I quietly built something of my own. I transferred every file from the cloud into new folders on my laptop, backing them up with meticulous order. I made a spreadsheet, color-coded, organized by date and content. Not to weaponize, just to understand. When viewed this way, the truth became less emotional and more structural. There were timelines, overlaps, contradictions. Each line of data revealed the intention behind his actions more clearly than any confession could. I labeled documents by month, saved voice notes in chronological order, and archived screenshots with timestamps. This wasn't petty, it was preparation.
It grounded me in something steady while everything else slipped further into pretense. The more I organized, the more my mind sharpened, forming a blueprint for whatever path I would choose next. Occasionally, I caught hints of the other woman in the air around him. A faint floral scent he didn't notice clinging to his clothes, the slightly brighter gel in his hair, the softened tone he used when checking his messages behind a half-turned shoulder. But none of it stung the way it did before. There was an odd relief in seeing the truth clearly, without distortion. When betrayal becomes fact, it stops feeling like a threat and becomes something you can carry without shaking. I started to recognize the difference between love and attachment, between habit and choice. The ache was still there, but it no longer drowned me. Instead, it carved space inside me for something I hadn't felt in weeks. Self-respect returning slowly, quietly, like light through a drawn curtain. By the end of the week, I no longer felt tethered to the hollow version of us he was trying to maintain. I could sit across from him at dinner without analyzing every shift in his eyes. I could hear his lies without flinching. Knowing the truth gave me distance, an emotional seatbelt that kept me steady, while the car he was driving veered into places he assumed I'd never see. He thought the new phone gave him protection, but I had already stepped out of that dance, holding the real narrative in my hands. I closed my laptop one quiet night, the air calm around me, and exhaled. Whatever came next, I wouldn't meet it blindly. I wasn't waiting for him to change. I was preparing for myself. It happened on a Thursday evening, the kind of uneventful weekday when nothing is supposed to break. I was in the kitchen reheating leftovers when Jake walked in, his face drained of color, shoulders stiff with a tension I'd never seen before. He held his new phone like it was burning his hand. "Everything okay?" I asked, keeping my tone soft, steady. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he set the phone on the counter with a shaky exhale. "There's something wrong with my backup," he muttered. "A bunch of old data showed up, stuff I deleted months ago." My pulse remained calm, almost eerily so. "That happens sometimes," I said lightly, stirring the pot on the stove. "Sink issues." He didn't look convinced. He wiped his palms on his jeans and checked the screen again as if hoping the problem would disappear. But truth doesn't vanish just because panic wishes it would. He opened a message thread and stared at it with the stiffness of a man bracing against a wave. "This isn't supposed to be here," he whispered under his breath. "I wiped this." His thumb hovered over the screen, trembling. I watched him without watching him, keeping my movements slow and natural. "Maybe the cloud kept a copy," I offered. "Technology is weird." He shot me a glance, quick, sharp, suspicious, before schooling his expression into neutrality. "Yeah, maybe." But fear had already rooted itself in his posture. His mind raced ahead, scrambling to make sense of the reappearing messages. If he had deleted the evidence, then where had the evidence come from? His breathing grew shallow. He wasn't worried about me seeing them. He was terrified that someone else might. He stepped into the living room and began pacing, tapping frantically at the screen, reopening the same threads again and again as if repetition might rewrite reality. I leaned against the doorway, folding my arms loosely. "Do you want help?" I asked. His reaction was immediate and sharp. "No." Not angry, defensive, guarded. The kind of no spoken by someone hiding behind a collapsing barricade. He ran his hands through his hair, muttering to himself about glitches, server errors, corrupted backups. But beneath the technical excuses was a deeper truth he refused to name. The control he had relied on was slipping, and he didn't know how to stop the unraveling. I watched him try to outrun his own guilt, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to chase after him or smooth things over. His panic was not my responsibility. Hours later, he sat hunched on the couch, elbows on his knees, staring at the phone screen that refused to lie for him. I brought him a glass of water and set it on the coffee table. He looked up, eyes unfocused. "Emma," he said quietly, "if anything ever looked strange on my phone, just know there's an explanation." His voice wavered. I had never heard him sound so unsure of himself. I met his gaze, keeping my expression calm, unreadable.
"Everyone has explanations," I replied softly. "The question is whether they're true." Something flickered in his eyes. Fear, guilt, maybe recognition. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. Whatever excuse he was reaching for dissolved before it reached his tongue. The silence between us deepened, thick and heavy, settling like dust on untouched shelves. He swallowed hard and looked away, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't want you to misunderstand anything," he murmured. The irony nearly made me laugh, quietly, bitterly. But I kept my breathing even. "I'm not misunderstanding," I said gently. "If anything, I'm seeing things more clearly than before." He froze. The air shifted, tense and fragile. He searched my face for clues, for accusations, for an opening to deny something I hadn't even spoken aloud. But I offered none. I wasn't here to drag him into a confession. I wasn't here to validate his guilt or soothe his panic. Letting him sit in that uncertainty felt more honest than any confrontation could have been. Truth doesn't need to be shouted. Sometimes it just needs to be acknowledged without mercy. Later that night, after he retreated to the bedroom with the phone clutched tightly in his hand, I stood alone in the living room. The lights were low, shadows stretching long across the hardwood floor. His words echoed faintly in my mind, not because they hurt, but because they revealed something essential. He was no longer confident in his ability to hide. His two worlds, the one he curated for her and the one he performed for me, had brushed against each other, and the friction rattled him. I walked to the window and let the cool night air settle against my skin. This wasn't the end, not yet. But it was the beginning of him realizing that the truth he buried had already begun to surface. And I didn't need to force it. It would come on its own. It was late, past midnight, when I finally opened the newest batch of synced files on my laptop. The house was quiet, except for the faint creak of the hallway vent and Jake's uneven breathing behind the bedroom door. He'd fallen asleep clutching his phone again, as if proximity alone could protect him from whatever truth threatened to rise. I sat on the couch wrapped in a thin blanket, scrolling through the updated folders. Most of the new data was familiar. Repeated messages, recycled phrases, more of the same soft betrayals. But then a set of photos appeared, ones I hadn't seen before. They were taken at a restaurant with dim amber lighting, elegant plates, wine glasses half full. In each shot, Jake's smile was unguarded, warm in a way I hadn't seen in months. But what captured me wasn't him, it was her. In the corner of one photo, partially reflected in the sheen of a polished table, I finally saw the woman clearly. Not just a silhouette or a blur of hair, her face. Soft features, a gentle curve of a smile, eyes crinkling with quiet affection. She wasn't glamorous in an unbelievable way. She was approachable, warm, real. The kind of woman people naturally leaned toward. And in that tiny reflection, angled just right, she was looking at him the way I used to, full of softness, unguarded admiration. My chest tightened, not from jealousy but from recognition. This wasn't a fling, not a distraction, not an accident. This was emotional investment. Two people meeting in a space I no longer occupied. I clicked through the images slowly, absorbing each detail with steady breath. Her hand resting near his, their heads tilted slightly closer with each new frame. A napkin folded neatly in front of her, the edge brushing his plate.
They weren't touching, but everything in their postures suggested they didn't need to. The intimacy lived in the quiet space between them. In one photo, he was laughing, really laughing. His face lit with the kind of ease I hadn't seen from him in years. A heaviness settled over me, soft but overwhelming. I wasn't angry. I wasn't devastated. I was grieving, the way a person grieves a version of life that has already slipped through their fingers without a sound. I zoomed in on her face, studying the lines of someone I'd never met but who, without knowing it, had stepped directly into the center of my marriage. Her features weren't threatening. There was no malice in her expression. Just someone who looked kind. That kindness made the betrayal cut deeper. It meant she wasn't a villain. She was simply filling a space he had willingly opened. And that realization stripped away the part of me that wanted to blame her. The truth wasn't tangled. It wasn't complicated. He chose her. He created the opportunity. He built the bridge and invited her to cross. I sat back, letting the weight of that truth settle into the quiet of the living room. As I closed the photo and returned to the folder, a new message thread popped up, one that hadn't been there earlier. A fresh exchange time-stamped barely 2 hours ago. She fell asleep early, Jake had written. I miss you. The reply came seconds later. I miss you too. Did you like the picture? I stared at the screen, a slow exhale leaving my lungs. So the photos weren't accidental. They were deliberate, taken for her, shared with her. Moments crafted intentionally to be exchanged in the dark of night while I slept in the next room. I didn't cry. I didn't break. I simply accepted that the truth had crossed the final threshold. I closed my laptop gently, letting the click of the hinge echo softly across the room. The night felt colder, but my mind was strangely calm. Awake, clear, steady. I stood, wrapped the blanket tighter around my shoulders and walked to the bedroom doorway. Jake slept with his back turned, the new phone cradled in his hand like a fragile secret. I watched him for a long moment, understanding something I'd been resisting for weeks. I wasn't competing with another woman. I was confronting a man who had already left our marriage long before I discovered it. And now that I'd seen the truth fully, her face, his choice, their connection, I felt a quiet resolve settle inside me. Whatever came next would not be a reaction. It would be a decision. Over the next few days, I watched their communication unfold not with shock, but with a strange, measured detachment, like observing a study of human behavior, rather than the unraveling of my marriage. Their patterns became obvious, almost predictable. Jake texted her most often in the early morning before I woke, and late at night after he assumed I was asleep. Lunchtime brought shorter messages, small jokes, quick updates, little bursts of intimacy they tried to disguise in brevity. I began to map their cadence, noting the times he grew suddenly distant or overly affectionate with me, moments that aligned precisely with when she replied. It was like watching a tide come in and out, each wave pulling him farther from the shore we once shared. What surprised me wasn't the content of their messages. It was the routine behind them. He had a rhythm with her, a comfortable emotional script he slipped into effortlessly. They spoke about their day, shared glimpses of things they found amusing, exchanged reassurances whenever one of them felt insecure. It wasn't grand passion. It wasn't reckless infatuation. It was consistency, practiced openness, emotional caretaking, a steady drip of affection he no longer offered me. The normalcy of it stung more than any dramatic declaration could have. They were building something ordinary together. And ordinary, I realized, is what hurts the most. Their calls were always brief, never longer than a minute or two. He was careful, strategic. But even in those snippets, I heard it. The softened tone, the quiet warmth, the subtle intimacy woven into the gaps between words. Sometimes he stepped into the garage to call her.
Other times, he pretended to take out the trash and stayed outside just long enough to murmur a few sentences that didn't belong to me. I didn't listen to every audio clip. I didn't need to. The emotional trajectory was unmistakable. They weren't on the verge of falling in love. They were already there, living in it quietly, comfortably, as though my existence were a minor logistical detail rather than a life he had vowed to share. One afternoon, while he was at work, I sat at the dining table with the blinds half drawn, sorting through more of the synced files. A new thread caught my eye. Plans. Not dramatic ones, not secret trips or hotel rooms, but small, intimate ideas about coffee dates, a bookstore she wanted to take him to, a quiet park he said he liked walking through alone. They were carving out a life in the spaces between responsibility and secrecy. And strangely, that piece of information didn't shatter me. It clarified something I hadn't wanted to admit. They fit. Not because she was better, not because I was lacking, but because he had already shifted toward her long before she stepped into the picture. He had opened the door, and she had simply walked through. I paused over one final exchange. Her. I hope she's okay. I don't want to be the reason someone gets hurt. His response came quickly. You're not. It's complicated. She and we've been off for a long time. I read the lines slowly, letting them settle. She wasn't malicious. She wasn't scheming. She was someone who had been handed a curated version of the truth, a story sculpted to justify his choices. I couldn't blame her for believing it. I couldn't even blame her for wanting him. The betrayal belonged to him alone. The weight of that realization lifted some invisible pressure from my chest. She hadn't taken him. He had offered himself generously, willingly, without hesitation. By the time evening wrapped itself around the house, I had closed the laptop and sat quietly in the dim light of the living room, absorbing the full shape of the truth. There was no anger burning inside me, only clarity, sharp and still. I understood their rhythm, their emotional dependence, their plans. But more importantly, I understood myself. I wasn't waiting for him to change. I wasn't hoping for reconciliation or confession. I was preparing for a life where I carried the truth without letting it break me. Jake was living two lives, but only one of us was awake enough to see both clearly. And that clarity, in its quiet, steady power, felt like the first real step forward. By Sunday morning, I felt something subtle but unmistakable shift inside me. The suspicion that had shadowed me for weeks no longer pulsed through my thoughts. It was gone. Not healed, not resolved, but dissolved by the weight of certainty. I stood at the kitchen sink rinsing berries, sunlight warming my forearms, and realized I no longer needed to second-guess anything Jake said or did. There was nothing left to uncover. The truth wasn't a puzzle anymore, it was a completed picture, framed and clear. When Jake walked into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes and offering a half-tired smile, I felt no urge to study his expression or decode his tone. The part of me that once strained to read him had gone quiet. Suspicion requires hope. Certainty does not. He poured himself coffee, watching me over the rim of the mug with a careful, assessing gaze. "You're quiet," he said. His voice held a tentative softness, as if testing the ground between us. I shrugged lightly, wiping my hands on a towel. "Just tired." The words were true in a way he couldn't understand. I wasn't tired from doubt, I was tired from knowledge. He searched my face for longer than necessary, his eyes flickering with something like unease.
Maybe he sensed the shift. Maybe he recognized the stillness in me as something unfamiliar. "We should do something today," he offered.
"Get out of the house." Once I would have grabbed that thread, tried to weave closeness back into the space between us, but I no longer felt compelled to save what he had already abandoned. He kept glancing at his new phone, checking it with the jittery habits of someone guarding a secret with too many open seams. I didn't react. I didn't look. I didn't need to. The truth wasn't in that device. It was archived somewhere he couldn't touch or redact. Watching him monitor the phone almost felt like watching someone tend to a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. Every notification made him twitch. Every dark screen made him uneasy. Meanwhile, the calm in my chest deepened, steady and unbothered. I wasn't fighting anymore. I had been carrying suspicion like a weight belt, tightening with every doubt. But now, with everything laid bare, I felt lighter. Not because the pain was gone, but because the guessing was over. We sat together on the couch later, a show playing on the TV neither of us was actually watching. Jake reached for my hand, a gesture meant to be sweet, familiar. But when our skin touched, I felt nothing stir. No spark, no warmth, no longing for what used to be. My hand simply rested in his, still and polite. He glanced at me, confusion flickering across his features, but he didn't speak. He squeezed once, perhaps hoping for a squeeze in return. I didn't pull away, I just didn't respond. He didn't know that the connection had already been severed days ago, softly, quietly, without confrontation. He thought we were in a slow patch, a temporary drift. He didn't see that I'd stepped off the ledge of hope entirely. That shift in me wasn't visible, but it was absolute. That night, while he showered, I opened my laptop again. Not to search for new information, I already had all I needed. Instead, I created a new document titled, "What Comes Next?" The cursor blinked at the top of the page, patient and unhurried. I began writing not about him, but about me, what I wanted, what I deserved, what kind of life I envisioned without the fog of confusion clouding every step. Clarity felt like oxygen filling lungs that had been starved for too long. As the words took shape, I felt my spine straighten, my shoulders loosen. This wasn't a list of plans. It was a declaration of self-respect. And it felt honest, in a way nothing between us had felt in months. When Jake emerged from the bathroom, hair damp, phone in hand, he asked, "Everything okay?" His voice carried the mild concern of someone who sensed disturbance but couldn't locate its source. I nodded gently. "Yes," I said. "Everything's clear now." He smiled, relieved, mistaking my calm for reconciliation. He had no idea that clarity didn't mean closeness. It meant the end of questioning him. The end of trying to fix something he had already left behind. As I closed my laptop and placed it on the nightstand, I felt a new steadiness take root. Suspicion had ended, and in its place stood certainty, quiet, unshaken, and ready for whatever truth demanded of me next. The call came on a quiet Tuesday evening, when the house held that soft, breathless stillness right before dusk. I was folding laundry on the bed, stacking shirts into careful piles, when Jake's new phone, carefully guarded, obsessively curated, lit up on the nightstand. He was in the shower, steam drifting from the cracked bathroom door. Normally he took the phone with him everywhere, but tonight he'd left it charging, perhaps assuming I wouldn't notice. I didn't move toward it. I didn't touch it. I simply watched the screen glow in the fading light. A name appeared, not a number this time. A name. Her name. The phone vibrated again, the soft hum threading through the room like a quiet confession. I folded another shirt, steady, calm.
I no longer needed to chase answers. They were walking themselves straight to me. A second call came, then a third. Persistent, urgent.
Her name pulsed across the screen with a frequency that felt intimate. Someone reaching out not out of courtesy, but out of fear or need. I paused, fingers resting on the cotton hem of a towel. If she was calling repeatedly, it wasn't accidental. Something had happened. Something in their carefully hidden world had cracked. The water in the bathroom shut off abruptly. Footsteps shuffled. Jake stepped out moments later, towel around his waist, hair dripping, humming lightly as if his world were perfectly intact. Then he saw the glowing screen. The hum died in his throat. His whole body stilled, frozen between denial and dread. He stared at the phone as though it were a detonator. He lunged for it, nearly slipping on the tile, snatching the device with a sharp inhale. "Why is she?" he began but cut himself off, jaw tightening. He turned his back to me, answering in a hushed whisper, his wet hair dripping onto the floor. "Hello? No, I can't talk right now." "No, I told you, not when I'm home." His voice broke into a strained rustle, the sound of a man trying to cage chaos with bare hands. I didn't interrupt. I didn't react. I continued folding the laundry, each movement gentle, deliberate. The towel, the shirts, the steady rhythm of domestic life continuing beside him as his second world skidded out of control. He threw a quick glance over his shoulder, panic flickering in his eyes. The contrast between us, the calm and the collapse, felt almost surreal. When he ended the call, he stood in silence for a long moment, phone pressed to his forehead as if willing the world to rewind. Then he turned, forcing a weak smile. "Wrong number," he said. The lie came out thin, frayed. I placed another folded shirt onto the stack. "If you say so." My voice was soft, even, unthreatening. But something in the simplicity of my response made him tense. He waited for me to press, to accuse, to demand. But I offered nothing. No interrogation, no emotional explosion. Just silence. And that silence, the one he couldn't argue with or manipulate, unsettled him more than any confrontation could. He hovered in the doorway, unsure of what version of himself he was supposed to perform next. He sat beside me on the bed, still clutching the phone with a trembling grip. "Emma," he murmured, "if anything feels off, it's just stress. Things are complicated at work." The deflection was almost insulting in its predictability. I turned to look at him, and for the first time in a long time I saw him not as my husband, but as a man trying desperately to outrun the consequences of his own choices. His eyes darted across my face, searching for suspicion. What he found instead was clarity. "I'm not confused," I said quietly, "and I'm not asking any more." His breath hitched. He understood then. Something in me had shifted beyond reach. He couldn't deny me back into ignorance. He couldn't charm me back into softness. I wasn't guessing. I knew. That night, after he fell asleep with the phone locked tightly under his pillow, I sat in the dim hallway with my knees drawn up, letting the quiet settle around me. The call had changed nothing, and everything. I didn't need to hear their words. I didn't need proof written in flames. The desperation in his voice, the repeated calls, the trembling in his hands, those were confessions in their purest form. The truth was no longer something hidden. It was something alive, breathing through the cracks of our home. As I stood and walked back toward the bedroom, a new certainty formed inside me. Calm, resolute, unshakable. I wasn't living in suspicion anymore. I was living in truth. And truth has a way of clearing the path forward, even when the next steps are still wrapped in darkness.
He left the house earlier than usual that Friday. Shirt pressed, hair styled with more care than he realized. A hint of cologne that wasn't the one he wore for me. "Big deadline," he said, grabbing his keys. I simply nodded.
The door clicked shut behind him, and the house fell into a spacious, echoing quiet. I didn't check the cloud. I didn't open the folders. I didn't monitor his movements. I spent the evening cleaning slowly, making the bed, washing dishes, lighting a candle on the dining table. Not out of routine, but out of a desire to feel grounded in my own space again. By 9 the candle had burned low. By 10 the house still held its silence. And by 11 I understood fully. He wasn't coming home that night. I sat on the couch with a blanket pulled over my legs, phone resting untouched beside me. He'd sent one brief text around 8:14 p.m. "Don't wait up, might be late." That was it. A message trimmed of guilt, shaped by convenience, designed to close a door rather than open a conversation. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I leaned back against the cushions, letting the weight of the moment settle. Not heavy, not crushing, just real. This was no longer about infidelity. It was about abandonment wrapped in excuses. The distance he had created wasn't subtle anymore. It was mapped out in hours and empty rooms. Midnight crawled across the ceiling, slow and indifferent, and I exhaled with a clarity that surprised me. I wasn't waiting for him. I was witnessing the ending. Around 1 a.m, rain began tapping softly against the windows, a rhythmic pattern that filled the quiet house with an oddly comforting steadiness. I stood by the living room window, watching the street glisten under the soft streetlights. A few cars passed, their tires hissing against the wet pavement, but none slowed near our driveway. I could imagine exactly where Jake was, filling the absence he'd carved into our marriage with someone else's presence. Maybe he was laughing softly. Maybe he was asleep beside her. Maybe he was pretending he didn't have a wife at home, who once would have stayed awake, worrying. But I didn't worry. Not tonight. Tonight, I simply observed the truth in its barest form. A man choosing another life while assuming I would remain waiting in the shadows of the one he left behind. I walked into the bedroom and opened my laptop, not to check on him but to finish the document I had started days earlier. What comes next? I added a few thoughts, practical ones, not emotional. Steps I needed to take, accounts to separate, papers to gather. A conversation with myself had begun, one rooted not in heartbreak but in preparation. The page wasn't filled with anger. It wasn't filled with bitterness. It was steady, thoughtful, deliberate. The rain continued its quiet percussion outside, marking each step I typed with a soothing metronome. I wasn't planning an escape. I was planning a future. A future not built around suspicion or waiting or begging for honesty. A future built around the truth I had already accepted, that our marriage was a shell he had already stepped out of. When the clock slipped past 2, I finally closed the laptop and lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling fan moving in slow, deliberate circles. The sheets felt cold on his side, untouched, uncreased. It struck me how familiar that coldness had become, not just tonight, but for months. Physical presence had been an illusion long before he failed to come home. Emotional distance had been eroding us grain by grain, quiet enough to ignore until the silence became a chasm. I reached over and smoothed the empty pillow beside me, not with sadness but with a strange tenderness. Not for him, for myself. For the woman who had stayed, who had tried, who had trusted longer than she should have. I fell asleep sometime before dawn, wrapped in the thin hush of early morning light. When I woke, the other side of the bed was still empty. No new messages, no apologies. Just absence, undeniable and complete. I sat up slowly,
letting the clarity of it wash through me. This wasn't a crack in our marriage. This was the collapse. Quiet, unannounced, inevitable. And instead of breaking me, it steadied me. Because now, finally, there was nothing left to question, nothing left to doubt, nothing left to save. The sun filtered gently through the curtains, lighting the corner of the room where my folded notes rested. I stood, anchored by the truth, and breathed in a new kind of morning, one that didn't wait for him to come home. Jake came home the next afternoon, sunlight at his back, clothes wrinkled, hair slightly mussed in a way that didn't belong to sleep. He paused in the doorway like he wasn't sure what version of the house he was returning to. "Hey," he said carefully, voice low. I looked up from the dining table where I was organizing documents, my own, not his. Insurance forms, bank statements, a copy of the lease. His eyebrows pulled together. "What's all that?" I closed the folder calmly. "Just things I'm sorting." He hesitated, searching for a safe response. "You were asleep when I got in," he added quickly, as if offering proof he'd been beside me. "Didn't want to wake you." I nodded once, letting the lie pass between us unchallenged. For the first time, it didn't sting. It simply confirmed what I already knew. He hovered by the counter, one hand on the back of a chair, the other wrapped around his phone like a lifeline. "About last night," he began. His voice trailed off into a vague apology, shaped more by habit than remorse. "Work kept me. Things ran late." I let him finish without interrupting. He waited, no doubt expecting me to probe, to plead, to unravel the story he'd halfway constructed. But I only tilted my head slightly. "You don't have to explain," I said softly. His expression flickered. Confusion, relief, then something like suspicion. He wasn't ready for my calm. He didn't know where to place it. The ground beneath him shifted because I was no longer standing where he expected me to be. He sat across from me, fingers tapping nervously against his phone. "Are we okay?" he asked, voice cracking around the edges. The question wasn't about us. It was about him, about whether his lies were still safe behind the version of me who once tried to believe them. I studied him quietly, every exhaustion-lined crease, every darting glance toward the device he couldn't let out of reach. "I'm not angry," I replied, and it was true. Anger had burned out weeks ago. What remained was clarity. He blinked, trying to decode my tone. "Then what's going on?" he pressed. His patience was thin, fraying. He needed a script to follow, a way back to the marriage he performed but no longer lived in. But I wasn't offering him a script. I wasn't offering him anything but truth. "I know," I said, calm, steady, unadorned. The two words hung in the air between us, landing with the quiet force of a weight placed on a fragile shelf. He froze. His fingers stopped tapping. His breath hitched. "Know what?" he asked, too quickly. I didn't answer his question directly. I didn't need to. I simply held his gaze, letting the silence do what explanations never could. His face shifted. Denial, fear, calculation. All flickering like faulty light bulbs. "Emma," he whispered, "you're misunderstanding something." But the moment the words left his mouth, he knew how hollow they sounded. There was nothing to misunderstand. The truth wasn't hiding anymore. It was sitting between us at the table, full and undeniable, waiting. He swallowed hard, voice collapsing into something thin. "If you've seen something, it's taken out of context." The desperation in his tone surprised even him. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tight as if he were praying for a version of events that could excuse him. I didn't flinch. "There's no context," I said softly. "Just choices." His mouth opened slightly like he wanted to argue, but nothing came. Every excuse he'd used before, every half-story, every softened explanation, all of it dissolved under the weight of those words.
He sat back, slowly, realization dawning in the slow, painful way truth arrives when there's nowhere left to run. The silence thickened, not tense, not angry. Final. He broke first. "Emma, please, tell me what you think you know." I closed the folder in front of me and placed my hands gently on top of it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list evidence. I didn't recite screenshots or play recordings or show him the photos that had made everything undeniable. Instead, I said quietly, "I know enough." His face paled. His breath grew shallow. He understood exactly what that meant and what it didn't leave room for. This wasn't a request for explanation or reconciliation. This was an acknowledgement, recognition. The truth brought into the light without theatrics or shouting. The beginning of the end spoken in calm, steady reflection. And as he sat across from me, unraveling, I finally felt grounded, fully, quietly myself. The air felt impossibly still as we sat across from each other. Two people who had shared a life, now separated by a truth that would not shrink or soften. Jake leaned forward, elbows on the table, hands woven together like he was bracing for impact. "Emma, tell me what you saw," he pleaded, voice trembling in a way I had never heard from him before. But I didn't need to recount anything. The truth wasn't a scene to replay, it was a conclusion. I folded my hands quietly. "I'm not here to make you confess," I said. "The facts exist whether you admit them or not." He flinched, as if the calmness hurt more than anger would have. The sunlight shifted through the window, sliding across his face, revealing a man finally forced to see himself without the fog of denial. He searched my expression for an opening, for softness, for forgiveness, for any hint that I might still be persuadable. "I messed up," he whispered, the understatement almost absurd in its smallness. "But it's not what you think." I held his gaze. "I'm not guessing anymore," I replied. His mouth opened, then closed,
The arguments dying in his throat. Without shouting, without evidence spread across the table, the power dynamic shifted entirely. He was the one scrambling for footing. I was the one who finally understood the ground beneath me. He rubbed his forehead, sighing hard. "Can't we fix this?" The question landed with a heaviness that didn't break me. I shook my head softly. "You can only fix what you haven't already walked away from." The realization sank into him slowly, his shoulders curling inward, as though he were collapsing around a grief he had never imagined would come from his own choices. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," he murmured. "I don't even know how it happened." I exhaled, not in frustration but in clarity. "It happened because you wanted it to. Maybe not all at once, maybe in small steps, but you made decisions, one after another, and they led you exactly where you are." His eyes glassed over, but I didn't reach for him. Compassion wasn't the same as forgetting. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my tone steady. "This conversation isn't punishment. It's closure." The word hung there, heavy and undeniable, marking the space where something once living had finally died. He wiped his face with trembling fingers. "I'll end it," he said suddenly, desperation tightening his voice. "I'll block her, delete everything, start fresh. Just don't give up." His plea might have sliced through me weeks ago, when I was still clinging to the possibility of repair. But now, truth had rearranged everything. "It's not her you need to end," I said quietly. "It's the version of yourself you became when you thought I'd never find out." He stared at me, stunned, as if those words revealed a cliff he hadn't noticed he was standing on. I continued, calm and unwavering. And I won't build my life around someone who doesn't recognize when the line was crossed. His breath shuddered, the reality settling in, not as punishment, but as consequence.
Silence filled the room again, different from before. Not tense, not suspenseful, just final. Jake leaned back, hands limp at his sides, phone resting untouched for the first time in months. "I didn't think you'd leave," he whispered. I nodded. That was the mistake. He swallowed hard, grief pressing into every line of his face. "Do you still love me?" he asked, voice soft and terrified. I didn't answer right away. I thought about all the nights I'd stayed awake, the files I'd reviewed, the truths I'd accepted piece by piece. "Love isn't the problem," I finally said. "Trust is. And I won't stay in something that asks me to shrink just to survive it." His eyes fell, shoulders sagging, as though hearing the final verdict he had delivered to himself long ago. I stood up slowly, gathering the folder of documents from the table. Not evidence, not ammunition. Just the beginning of the life I was choosing next. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice small. "Forward," I said. "No anger, no cruelty, just truth." I walked toward the doorway, pausing only once to look back. Jake sat at the table, the afternoon light carving him into someone both familiar and distant. The man I married had disappeared long before this conversation. What remained was someone still learning how to live with the consequences of his own choices. I stepped outside, closing the door gently behind me. The sun met my face, warm and steady. For the first time in months, the air felt wide enough to breathe, and my life, finally, felt like something I could reclaim. He didn't lose me the day I discovered the truth. He lost me the moment he chose a life he thought I'd never see. And when I finally stepped away, it wasn't out of anger. It was out of clarity. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk toward a future that doesn't require you to beg for honesty. My story isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming the pieces of yourself that someone tried to make small. If you've ever felt that quiet ache, the one that tells you something is wrong even when the world insists it's fine, I hope this ending reminds you that your intuition is worth listening to. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever reached a turning point where the truth changed everything? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one. And if this story moved you, helped you, or made you feel less alone, don't forget to subscribe. More powerful stories are coming.